Well, if you take Mitch McConnell at his word, the FBI has just a handful of days left until the Senate's deadline to submit a report on the expanded probe into this man, the Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. There have been accusations by Senate Democrats that the White House is guiding the FBI in an investigation that's actually a background check, while the president claims agents have free rein within reason. So let's look at who is being interviewed and who's not. The White House originally directed the FBI to interview these three people about Professor Christine Blasey Ford's allegations. The first two, Mark Judge and Patrick P.J. Smith, were friends of Kavanaugh's that Ford identified as being at the gathering when she was allegedly assaulted. As of this morning, Judge has completed his interview with the FBI. The third person is Leland Kaiser, Professor Ford's friend, who also is alleged to have been at the house when the assault took place. All right, Senate Judiciary Committee Democrats want Kavanaugh and Ford interviewed, along with four other boys identified on Kavanaugh's calendar as being at that July 1st gathering with Kavanaugh, Mark Judge, and Smith. Democrats are also seeking FBI interviews from Jeremiah Hanafin, the man who administered Professor Ford's polygraph, as well as Ford's husband and her three friends, all of whom signed declarations that she discussed this assault with them between 2012 and 2017, well before Kavanaugh's nomination. As for the allegation from his freshman year at college, the White House directed the FBI to only interview the accuser, Deborah Ramirez. She spoke to agents on Sunday, but Democrats are also urging agents to interview others, both Ramirez and Kavanaugh's roommates, who at the time both commented on Kavanaugh's heavy drinking, and three more classmates who say they either heard about the incident, discussed Kavanaugh's behavior in general, or witnessed Kavanaugh's drinking habits. And there are five other Yale classmates of Kavanaugh's and Ramirez's not on the list. The New York Times points out that two of them, Charles Ludington and Daniel Levon, say they saw Kavanaugh extremely intoxicated to the point of disorientation, and three others who say they never saw him get excessively drunk. And this is where the problem lies. There are a bunch of witnesses, and they have different things to say, and we're not 100% sure who the FBI is or is not interviewing at this point.
The problem also lies with the fact that this is an unforced error. On Thursday, Judge Brett Kavanaugh brought this upon himself, and that's why people sort of started to
by
come
talking
out
about his drinking or not, how he behaved.
This whole how could I possibly have been a partier? I was just a great student who loved faith and basketball. And you know what? Maybe it was more than that, which it was more than for loads of college and high school students. The issue is, why wasn't he straightforward about it? Joining us now, NBC News national political reporter who has got some really important stuff. I want you to pay attention to this story. Our colleague Heidi Przybyla and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade, and with us, former FBI special agent and fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, Michael German. Heidi, to you first. You have got some extraordinary reporting on Judge Kavanaugh and this Ramirez allegation, which he claimed he knew nothing about until the New Yorker piece came out. What was it, September 23rd?
Correct. And to add to your narrative there about people not being interviewed, add my source, the woman whose text messages I obtained to that list. She is a mutual friend of Debbie Ramirez and was familiar with Brett Kavanaugh. But the information that she has, she says, should be looked at by the FBI, and at this hour is not. She's made several attempts to reach the FBI, to send them her memo, to get some kind of a response, and she's not. So
and
what
her
does she
claim
have?
Is what?
So she has text messages with the wife of one of the men who was allegedly a witness to the incident, who may have been egging on Brett Kavanaugh during the incident. And these text messages show, she says, that Brett Kavanaugh or his team, she calls him by his name, Brett, was doing things behind the scenes in the advance of the New Yorker article. Now, it's important to say, Steph, we don't know specifically when Brett Kavanaugh became aware of the New Yorker article, and if this was just like a last-minute effort to try and quash the article, or if his knowledge of Debbie Ramirez's allegations well predates the New Yorker article. That is why Carrie Burcham, who is the woman whose memo I obtained, wants the FBI to look into this. Secondly, her text messages with the wife of one of the men who may have witnessed this incident. She says they were all at a wedding together about 10 years after the incident, and she calls her friend out and she says, you know, I noticed that Debbie was really uncomfortable during the wedding, and she was clinging to me, even though she was friends with you guys. So now it all makes sense to me. She was avoiding Brett. She was acting weird, and now it makes sense to me. And then she also kind of calls her friend out for allowing herself to be used as an anonymous source, basically negating Debbie's claims. And the woman, her friend, replies back to her and says, "I never said that. I just said I didn't know." And so kind of walking back what was in that statement from the New Yorker. So all of this stuff, just to not lose the main point here, is that there are more people who are, I would say, desperately trying to get their information to the FBI to be reviewed.
That's just a weird, that final sentence is just a weird one. People are trying to desperately get their information to the FBI. In the case of this woman you've interviewed, whose memo you have, she sent it to the FBI.
Several times. And she was then referred to a field office where she was told they don't do that. They don't intake that type of information.
Allie, yesterday, a former classmate from Yale of Brett Kavanaugh's reached out to me, anonymously, but he said he called the FBI himself in the last few days to say it was only one incident, but on one specific incident while at Yale, he saw Brett Kavanaugh belligerent drunk. So irrelevant of how many people the FBI is reaching out to, we know for a fact there are Yale students calling them saying his story, clean cut, not true.
So, Michael, just let's talk about this. Maybe there are restrictions or whatever the case is on the FBI. It sounds like the White House has said interview whomever you need to, as long as you do it within the week. It would strike me as odd that the FBI is not able to take or redirect certain information. Is that unusual to you?
Quite unusual and quite troubling. I mean, one of the things that assuaged my concerns about the short time period was I assumed that over the last 8 weeks, as this has been the top of the news, that the FBI was receiving all kinds of allegations and perhaps not chasing them to ground, but at least having a roadmap for where this week-long investigation could go. So to hear that they're actually turning people away and not accepting their statements is hard for me to believe. I mean, the FBI is in the information business, right? They take anything from anyone, much less somebody talking about a sitting federal judge, somebody talking about somebody who has made repeated statements in sworn hearings and confirmation hearings. So that part of it is very strange to me, and particularly that we're having so many witnesses come forward saying that the FBI would either redirect them or simply not take their statement, suggests that the FBI itself is not necessarily handling this the way they would a normal investigation.
Barbara, let's just talk about what Heidi's talking about, that maybe Brett Kavanaugh knew about this New Yorker article and was trying to derail it or do whatever the case is. There are a lot of critics, particularly conservative critics, who say now everybody's going after Brett Kavanaugh for things that aren't about a sexual assault, but about things that he may not be all that forthcoming about. What, in your mind, as a former U.S. attorney, stands out if Brett Kavanaugh was texting people ahead of the publication of this New Yorker article? Maybe he knew it was coming out, or that they were looking into it to try to get people to corroborate his story or not corroborate Deborah Ramirez's story. What does that mean to you?
Well, it depends on the facts. One thing that would be impermissible would be if he was trying to reach out to friends to get them to falsely deny that this happened. If he were to do that, that could constitute a crime of obstruction of justice. Obstructing a matter before Congress can be considered obstruction of justice. That would be the worst case scenario. I don't think the facts yet get us there, and we don't know that that's the case. It may simply be that he was trying to encourage them that to tell what he remembers as the truth. Remember, this is how it happened. We've got pictures. We were friends. You need to help support that story and refute these false allegations. That's a different matter. There's two problems with that, though. One is that candidates are often told, don't work on your own investigation. You know, a person who represents himself as a fool for a client. Let us, the professionals at the White House and the Justice Department, take care of your background in dealing with all those things. So involving himself is a mistake. The other thing is, by opening the door, by refuting that he was a blackout drunk and all of these other things, I think he has put his credibility on the line. And so even if you wouldn't charge him with a crime for lying about these things, I think it goes to his integrity as an officer of the court. And the biggest problem with integrity when you have a background clearance is it leaves you open to blackmail. If there are people who know the truth that he's trying to keep secret, then that could leave him vulnerable to blackmail, which is not a position you want to be in for someone who has a top secret security clearance, as judges do.
Michael, it's hard to say any group of politicians or any one politician is the good guy, but clearly politics are being played in all of that. It's the FBI's job to separate things. Can the FBI get the amount of information they need in the time frame that's been put upon them? We know Chuck Schumer and others have already asked for more time, but then we do get into getting dangerously close to the midterms. Is a week enough to get the job done?
In normal circumstances, I would say where it's very limited additional inquiry. You remember, this person has been through at least 6 background investigations, so there should have been a wealth of information already available. But the idea that they were required to go back to the White House to ask to take the next step of the investigation would obviously delay their ability to move from one lead to another very quickly, and made that week-long period much harder to meet with any kind of integrity.
Barbara, Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley says he doesn't expect the FBI's report to be made public. Assess that for us, given that this entire proceeding, rightly or wrongly, is now in public.
Yeah, we're in such an odd place because ordinarily background investigations are not done publicly, but they're done before the person usually even gets nominated, much less confirmed. And so if there is a problem, they can be permitted to kind of quietly go away and be told, well, you made the short list, but you weren't the nominee. Instead, what we have is this very odd scenario where we've had the very public hearing, a demand for an FBI investigation, and I think there's going to be some desire for accountability and transparency in this. So it would be very unusual. Ordinarily, that is not made public. But I think in this situation, there's so much public interest in what the FBI found that I think it's going to be very difficult for them to keep it hidden.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.